Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Today is Tuesday in the Holy Week, and we are going to be talking about Jordan Peterson's video of death and resurrection of Christ. We're talking about the concept of sacrifice. This is part one. We are going to be discussing these concepts in more general way today, in an interactive way. I invite anybody who has watched the video to speak for up to 5 minutes on what they understand by this concept. Once everybody has had a chance to speak, we will go ahead and head into a discussion, either through first a breakout room and then Q&A, or directly into Q&A, depending on how we're doing on time. Okay, so please take your time in order to speak about what you get from this video and from this idea of death and resurrection of Christ. So go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you would like to share. I'm going to give priority to people whom I know are familiar with Jordan Peterson and are familiar with this material. So go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to share. Okay, who would like to get us started? We'll start with Evanik. Evanik, go ahead.
So when I watched this video and I compare it to the resurrection of Christ, I think what Jordan Peterson was getting at is that Christ was the ultimate example of what to do in terms of resurrection. And I think of it as like the phoenix, right? You know, the story of the phoenix where, you know, it burns and then it rises out of the flame, out of the ashes. And I was thinking the same thing of Christ. Like he went through the most horrible pain and the most horrible way to die. And then he resurrected himself. And the way I understood the Jordan Peterson video is that that's what we do. Like in this life, there is a lot of pain and there's a lot of suffering. And the one thing that we have to do is we have to accept that. And how do we live through that knowing that there's going to be pain and there's going to be suffering? And like, it's kind of like, well, what's the point of that, right? Because then there's the good too. You know, there's the resurrection, which is the good. It's how you learn and it's how you grow. And it almost, to me, appears cyclical, kind of like the Gita, in the sense that it's always just a circular thing. It's like you go through this thing where you're reborn and you grow. I guess I'll start it with rebirth, with birth, and then you have your growing pains, and then you go through suffering, and then a part of you dies. And the part of you that dies is the part of you that is kind of meant to die. And whether you believe in Christ or not, whether you believe in the resurrection or not, that's what life is kind of like. You grow, and then that part of you that is no longer serving you, you have to let die off. It's kind of like from the Peterson video, it's like you have to sacrifice that part now in order to move and to grow. And then when you're going through the death of Christ and he had to suffer, when there's a death, you're going to suffer. So when you let something die off, it hurts, and it hurts a lot. But it's necessary in order for you to be resurrected. And then once you're resurrected, there's a new life that starts for you, in a sense. Like Jesus got to ascend to heaven, but for us, while we're here on earth, we get to start a new phase of our lives. And then we go through that phase, and then we have to go through the same thing. So it's cyclical. So there's the good and the bad. And I think the key that what Jordan Peterson is trying to say is that we have to accept that part of life that is not pleasant, that is not fun, but it's okay because it will strengthen you. It will have you grow. It will make you a better person. You will be better because of it. So I think like that's the main point that I got from Jordan Peterson. And I never looked at the resurrection like that. So.
Thank you, Evanik. So what you're saying is that you're saying that in order to have new life, you have to give up parts of life, part of your old life, which are bad. And that's the only way you can be reborn. And it's a cyclical thing. It's not like a one-time thing at the end of your life, but it's a cyclical thing throughout your life. That's a process of growth. And it
Yeah.
requires, go ahead.
No, just one thing. It doesn't necessarily even have to be bad.
Mm-hmm.
Like it can, like it can be, like it could be a bad habit or something. It could be something in your life that you enjoyed, but it no longer serves you and it keeps you stuck.
Yes.
Like when Mike did his meetup on the comfort zone, it could be something that makes you comfortable. It could be something, but it doesn't allow you to grow, and eventually you'll be stuck. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. It might be something that you don't want to give up. It might be a person that you don't want to give up, but that person's no longer helping you grow or serving you, or like, like you outgrow certain friendships, or certain friendships grow apart. Nothing bad about the person necessarily, but it's just something that is no longer, like I know Black people, like I don't know if anybody's culture has this, but in the African American culture, we said each person either has a reason in your life, a season in your life, or they're meant to stay there a lifetime. There's very few people that will stay there, that are meant to stay there their lifetime. Most people are there for a season of your life, and they're there to help you grow. It's nothing wrong. So I just wanted to clarify that, but it still hurts.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Avanik. Next up is Becky. Becky, go ahead. Folks, go ahead and type exclamation mark. I would like to hear from as many of you about what you got from the video. Go ahead, Becky.
Sure. Are you sure? Because Joe has this up first.
That's okay. I've already negotiated with him.
Okay. So I got a lot out of this, and I want to first talk about what led to the death and resurrection of Christ, and that really originates with Adam and sin in the Garden of Eden. And if I can read from a passage in Romans, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. For sin indeed was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not counted where there is no law. Yet death reigns from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam, who was a type of the one who was to come. But the free gift is not like the trespass. For if many died through one man's trespass, how more have the grace of God and the free gift by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, abounds for many. And the free gift is not like the result of that one man's sin. And so my takeaway with all this is that at the end of the day, life is not a zero-sum game. And the sin, the fall that God knew was inevitable for mankind did not stop him from creating man. And it's through that fall, that understanding of what is evil and what is bad, that we can really come to understand what is good. But it's not equal and opposite. In fact, I truly believe that that it's through the hardship and the suffering that we can evaluate what is good, but extract what is good beyond in multitudes, multifolds over what is bad or what is harmful. And so God still created man knowing that sin would be introduced to the world, knowing that we would experience all this hardship. And he sent Jesus to be that redemption, but that way of redemption surpasses all that sin, and it never is. It's it's never equal, because if you even look at what light is compared to darkness, they're not equal and opposite. Like light, darkness is there, but darkness cannot overcome light. It's only present when the light is gone. So darkness is really dictated by the presence of light. So light has the power there. And same thing with the idea of Satan and God. They're not equal and opposite. And with sin and redemption, same thing. And so when Peterson talks about bringing life into the world, knowing that it's hard, knowing that that there's a lot of suffering, and he talks about the pietà, and describes it. It's courage for the Virgin Mary to know my son's going to die this awful death, but it's still worth it. I'm not going to shelter him, and she welcomes it. And with death and resurrection, death is not equal, because that resurrection is so much greater. And when we choose to die to ourselves and we are reborn, you're living into a potential, and every time you do it, that potential grows, and when you start really doing that, same thing, you have an obligation to the world, to your community, to give back. You can transform your pain, your suffering, and reach so many more people. So your pain and suffering, that's one person, that's you. But how many people can you inspire out of that? And that moves on, because now they're going to go on and inspire other people through that transformation of their pain. And so there's healing in multitudes. And so that's my take on the resurrection.
Well, thank you, Becky. I really like your observation about that. The light and darkness are not equal. Light shines in the darkness. And what, I don't know how to put it. The thing is that it's so difficult to talk about these things. And the only way I know of talking about it is to talk about it kind of poetically, metaphorically. This is about center and periphery. So the darkness is there in the periphery. And like when you move into light, you are actually generating light for other people. And that is going to show light onto a much greater area and much larger number of people. Like when you move towards darkness, you're creating your own darkness. You affect people, but you affect people in a smaller area. I mean, the dramatic example is that of Christ, or anybody who does anything magnificently great, because they are ideal for so many people. They light up lives of so many people. The concept that Aquinas has for this is that of contrary. It's not contradictory, but contrary. So the light will, darkness cannot survive where there is light. It is a reactive thing. Whereas light is the source of energy. It is source of life. Whereas darkness is the absence of it. It is, the distance from it. And that has a very different, they're contraries, but not contradictories. They're not equal and opposite. So that's a very, very fundamental, beautifully expressed. Thank you. Next up is Joe, Mike, and Shane Murray. Joe.
And so in full disclosure here, last 7 minutes, I didn't get to it, or 8 minutes, but from what I got from it, is this idea of what is and what you could be. This is where, and you see this in maps of meaning, and the different paths that we can take, and how the difficult path is sometimes we think we're on one way. And I actually said this last night, it was almost like Dante, but we're divergent through another, through chaos. We descend into chaos, and then our world, we have to kind of recover out of that. One of the things that I found to be really interesting in it was when he talks about how spirit is the process of a living force. Its manifestations, however, are concrete transformation of the spirit into matter. And essentially, what I essentially started to think of immediately was, Aristotle, and how the spirit and matter are one. And so you start to see the beauty of what it means, soul, within that process. There's also the idea of specifically, then we get into the importance of sacrifice itself, that you're sacrificing what for today in order to get to the person that you want to be. And and he talks about the sacrifices that Christ's made in this process, which was he gave up all the kingdoms of the world, it says, and that true. I printed it out, the transcript. It was Christ is he who rejects the kingdoms of the world, for the kingdom of God, Christ, is he who speaks the truth and creates habitable order that is good from chaos, and potential exists prior to the materialization of the reality of Christ, which wields potential as the sword that cleaves the death of Christ, is whose radical acceptance of conditioned life defeats hatred and bitterness. And essentially what's saying that Christ is bringing chaos, or bringing order to chaos. And he's doing that by rejecting the kingdoms of this world. He's doing that by essentially sacrificing, when he's tempted in the desert, that that he could have all the kingdoms of this world in order to just essentially bow down to the devil. And I think that this is an important point, is that Christ sacrifices not only those kingdoms, but he sacrifices himself for the rest of humanity. And that's kind of the sacrifice that we need to kind of go through. Life is, as Becky had mentioned, really a challenge at different points in time. And it's not meant to be easy. This is kind of the basis of what she said, is this is a fallen world. And that in a fallen world, that we have to offer up certain things in order to become the ideal person that we want to be. And the ultimate sacrifice is God and his son. He was pushed to the limits. Like, essentially, that's the boundaries of, like, that's the highest sacrifice that somebody could do. They're sacrificing not only themselves, but their children, their child as well. So he gets into the depth of sacrifice, just how great it has to be, how much we have to give of ourselves in order to be who we're going to, become whoever we're going to be. So there's other things, but those are my initial takeaways. The quote that Becky had mentioned last night, I think, was also included in there. And I think that actually did capture, more than anything, what the meaning of what that entire video. But I also think the light and darkness, I can come back to that though later, because I think that that's a really, really deep point.
Thank you. Either you or Becky, could you pull up that quote again? Because I want everybody to hear it. So I'm going to make 3 points, and then you can read the quote. One is the point of integration of spirit and matter. This is about creating heaven on earth. It is about word becoming flesh. It is about transforming life and making it as best as you possibly can. It's the highest ideal you can achieve on earth. That's the goal. And in order to do that, you have to sacrifice. In order to, what is sacrifice? Give up things which are in the periphery, which are the old forms of that you're used to, that are no longer actually driving the function that will get you to this highest possible. And that push to the limit, Peterson talks about, what is the highest sacrifice you can imagine? You can imagine sacrifice of a child, of your own child, or your own life, or yourself. And this is both of that together is what we're talking about here in the death and resurrection of Christ. So do any of you have the quote? Sure.
Yeah, I do. If the world you are seeing is not the world you want, therefore it is time to examine your values. It's time to rid yourself of your current presuppositions. It's time to let go. It might even be time to sacrifice what you love best so that you can become who you might, become, instead of staying who you are.
Thank you. All right, next up is Mike, Shane Murray, Maritza, Claire, and Jacob. Mike.
I especially liked his use of the term delayed gratification and delay. And I think if you prescribe or believe in what Joe just read, that you will find yourself in a community of people who are also doing the same thing. They're delaying their gratification and they're practicing delayed gratification at the same time. And at some point, you're going to interact with those people and you're going to have something he called an emerging social contract. You're just going to interact with someone. And then I think what happens is when you do that and you connect with someone when your values are aligned, I think you both have a vision of what your future selves will be like. So let's say, Shrikant, you and I agree to do something and we become friends. As life goes on, we both know that there's going to be some uncertainty in the future, but I can almost gauge what I think your future self, how it will react with my future self as we get to that point in life. So that if one of us falters, that perhaps you could push me back into a different direction. I think our future selves is really what reputation is all about. If you get a reputation for being a man or a woman that does X, Y, or Z, that people will expect when something happens that you're going to react in a certain way based on your past performance. So your future self is something that they look forward to seeing. And the opposite of that is if you do have a friend or someone in your circle of loved ones who can suddenly take on a nihilistic view. If you have someone that you care about deeply who suddenly says, why sacrifice? Because I don't see that, I don't see the benefit in the future for that, then perhaps if we're diligent enough to delay our own gratification, we're building something of a I'm trying to think of the right word, of a sort of a storage to be able to help that person if we can. To say, look, you're part of our community and we're kind of all walking in the same direction, but for some reason you're not now. So maybe I can catch you instead of just letting you go right away. But if it turns out I cannot pull you back, that's the point where maybe you have to let that person go so that you can continue down that path. So that was the main thing I took away. It's building your reputation and trust, because you believe that your future self will be in line with the people that you love and care about.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mike. So I'll make 2 points. I mean, one thing I like about what Jordan Peterson has done is that he uses the terminology that is used in common parlance today, like delayed gratification, and then ratchets it up to show what it means at the highest possible level. That's one thing. The second thing is your point about future self and community. I think that's a brilliant point of his, that when you negotiate with your future self, you're basically saying you're actually prioritizing production over consumption right now. And you are making yourself a better person. And in the same way, what you're doing is that you are storing that up as reputation in, in the goodwill that you have for other people. And it is happening at the same time. So that identification, I think, is very, very deep. Wonderful. All right. Let's see who's next. Next is Shane Murray. Shane Murray, go ahead.
Okay, I hope this is somewhat clear because I'm still struggling to put it together in my own mind. But what I was thinking in particular about resurrection is it seems to be the resurrection of our highest self can only be revealed through our responding to the tragedy of life with integrity. So we can't know the depths of our own perennial goodness unless we're paired up with some kind of sacrificial circumstance, because people can respond well in good times. It seems like we would have no means of knowing that until it's put to the test. And then the other thing that I thought of that just hit me is I think Jordan Peterson suggests this in some way, is that perhaps the resurrection is not guaranteed. So in essence, not all things turn out well, no matter how well you act. So we shouldn't expect that. And it made me think, just in this moment, that I love the idea of the resurrection being inconceivable for most people, because I think the very fact that it's inconceivable prevents us from counting on it as a guaranteed result to our sacrifice. So by the very nature of being unknown and uncertain and improbable, we're just left then with the power and gift of the sacrifice in and of itself, to let circumstance be whatever it is and rise to the occasion without guarantee of anything.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Shane Murray. Really appreciate that. Next up is going to be Maritza, followed by Claire and Jacob. Maritza.
For me, watching this video made me think of the idea that if we're not striving, we're not truly living. The one thing that was most powerful to me, and I'm totally winging it, Shrikant, I left my notes in the office. What the one line in the video that most gave me pause, and I'm still mulling over, was he quoted the gospel, Matthew, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And it was jarring to hear it. I did not anticipate that passage. Several others, I wouldn't have been shocked. I was shocked by that one. And so I kind of have been thinking about it. And I think the reason that one surprised me is that I had understood that passage often to be viewed as a moment of like weakness, a moment of a breaking, of perhaps even doubt. Looking at it through the words of Peterson makes me wonder or view that as potentially it could be those things, but that's not a negative. This is a natural order of the process, as it were. The breaking down process includes owning one's breaking or doubting moments. That's what I was thinking. There's in Peterson's book 12 Rules for Life, in Rule 7, which is the admonition to seek that which is meaningful, not that which is expedient. There's a little passage here I'd like to read for you guys. To stand up straight with your shoulders back is to accept the terrible responsibility of life with eyes wide open. It means deciding to voluntarily transform the chaos of potential into the realities of habitable order. It means adopting the burden of self-conscious vulnerability and accepting the end of the unconscious paradise of childhood, where finitude and mortality are only dimly comprehended. It means willingly undertaking the sacrifices necessary to generate a productive and meaningful reality. This quote, I actually looked for it because it's what came to mind with that one gospel phrase. And also what it brought to mind was what we learned about in the maps of meaning. I don't know if you remember the very odd, I don't know if it was a parable, but it was a really strange story about the two guys who had rocks and thought they had rubies. And the cautionary tale of not striving, and they did nothing, they had nothing, but they wanted all these riches without moving. And in the end of the story, the guy tells them, I'm going to give you what you deserve. And they got a bunch of worms. They got eaten by a bunch of worms, right? And so at the end of that parable, there's a piece that's telling us about that Jesus he's the Christian hero myth. He's the hero in that story, in the tale of resurrection. He's the hero, and he says that he's the Spirit, and he offers himself voluntarily to the cross, and that to me seemed to be a really important word, the voluntarily. Like, if we are forced to discard our ideas or things that we are holding on to, it's not the same. That voluntary aspect is what precipitates the shedding and the rebuilding that brings about, the change and the growth and the forward movement. We're reminded of that, and as we're going through in the maps of meaning, he tells us, interestingly, he goes ahead and ties that with it being humble. Like, this Spirit who's volunteering to put himself on the cross and through all this devastation, what we're being shown through this parable is the concept of being humble and of humility. And he then goes on to explain that the receiving of sacraments in the Christian religion is a reminder to us of this humility, of the idea of it's so that you can keep identifying with the concept of eternally dying and resurrecting. So it goes to what Evanique was saying of it being an iterative process, and that's why the Christians will go weekly, and they do this all the time, because it's a trigger mechanism for the fact it should be an ever constant thing. And I like the way Peterson tells us, he says it's a active, individually doomed, yet mythically eternal, destined to tragic contact with threat and promise of unknown, yet constant participant in the creative, adaptive, redemptive process. Now, there's a lot of adjectives there, but they all seem so vital to what it is that we're talking about here, this creative, adaptive, redemptive process. I mean, that's, when you think about what we're being shown, it's actually very few words. In 4 words, you're shown the entire tale of the Phoenix, of the hero Christ, of all these different mythologies of the death and rebirth. That's what it is. And I like that he tells us also it's a constant participant. So we cannot hold on to a rock and hang out on the side of the road and expect that we're going to get to whatever's at the end of the road. We have to propel ourselves forward. Sure, it's easier to stand, but in this oversimplified, but you have to make the strife of moving, because without movement, you're already dead. You just didn't know it yet. And I really I forget now who it is who mentioned that perhaps the resurrection is not a guaranteed. And I see that in this, because, Peterson is telling us that these different symbologies and rituals that are performed they are to remind us that we have to keep moving, that we have to keep this process going, because if we're not reminded, then entropy ensues. And so I could really see a lot of summary points in his video with many of his other works. And I thought it was one of his most concisely worded and explained points. Really, I thought it was a great video. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Marisa. So I want to make several points. I want to highlight several points. And then I want to apologize to Shane Murray. Shane Murray, what was happening was that my computer was running out of disk space, so I had to free it. So I did not pay attention. Could you do me a favor? Can you summarize what you said in a few sentences, please?
That might be hard because again, it's still not perfectly clear in my own mind. I think the main key was that, well, I'll just read it as I wrote it. The resurrection of our highest self can only be revealed through our responding to the tragedy of life with integrity. So in essence, we need some sufficient rub in order to reveal the depth of our character or what's perennial good within us. So we can all do well in good circumstances, but we really have no idea how we would perform until we're put to the test, essentially. And then the other thing was just that I love that, looking at it now, looking at it today, I love that the resurrection is inconceivable or incomprehensible or unlikely in most people's mind. Because I think if it came through as a guarantee, it would lose much of its meaning, which is to say that sacrifice should be without guarantee. Like the resurrection shouldn't. It's the same notion that I just said. So essentially, if you sacrifice knowing that there's resurrection or good to come from it, then it's not much of a sacrifice. So it's almost that you need that not to be present to really know the depths of your sacrifice. Could I say one thing or?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, this is, Maritza had touched upon that scripture, my God, why have you forsaken me, which is really deep and difficult. And I think it's hard to digest. But one of the things that hit me that I think, again, is beautiful about the telling of the story is that Jesus came knowing what his purpose was, right? That he had full knowing and he knew he was God's son and what his intent was. So the sacrifice is revealed in the moment when he shares with us that even God has left him. If he were up on the cross, and even God makes a sacrifice by not comforting him in that moment, saying, hold still, wait a minute, whatever it is. So it reveals this depth of sacrifice by God not coming to his rescue and Jesus not knowing he's there. So I don't know if that's helpful.
Thank you, Shane Murray. Very helpful. And what we're going to do is that we're going to really focus on this part. This is a key statement. So on Saturday, we're going to focus on this. What does this mean? We'll also look at what he says in the garden. If possible, take this cup away from me. But if not, yes. So that entire scene and the final statement, I'm reading, folks, Aquinas has fantastic commentary on this, all of this stuff. So please read it, because Aquinas, he summarizes everybody else's commentary. So Origen, Augustine, and all of these folks have thought so much about each of these things that it's going to really, that's why I want to do this as an introductory piece so that you can actually prepare for Saturday, 4:30. All right. So I want to make a couple of points. I think the point is crucial that when you're giving up something, you're saying, this is bad, I have to get rid of it. And you do not fully know what is going to be born as a result of it. You just know that this is bad. This is in the periphery. This is taking me in the wrong direction. I give that up. And partly what is living comes about because you clear it out. It's not as if you knew what is going to come. So you have to be willing to say that, okay, I'm going to give this up because it's bad. And by removing these negatives and feeling that you're kind of emotionally, you're throwing away parts of you, not knowing what is going to be, that uncertainty is part of growth. The points that Maritza made, the rock and the ruby, Peterson puts it very beautifully. He says, when things are going wrong with your life, most people just look at the world and say, what's wrong with the world? And what you have to do is that, what is wrong? Is there something that I value which is wrong? That I need to, do I have a ruby that I'm working, that I'm holding on to, which is actually a bunch of worms, and which is eating me actually as I hold it? That's typically what is going on. It doesn't happen at the end. It's actually happening to you while you're holding the ruby, while you think you're holding a ruby. So that's the other part is that it's a continual process. It's, you do this on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a moment-to-moment basis. Thank you. Next up is Claire, Jacob, and Jyoti. Claire.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see you all, and thank you for all of your interesting ideas. Really have me thinking. Peterson talks about this story and a lot of the biblical stories about being the connection between the metaphysical and the narrative, kind of coming up from the sky and then the narrative coming up from underneath. And he talks about that actually being a phenomenon he experiences in his own life, and he's seen and he's witnessed. And that makes me think, well, shoot, I haven't seen any of that, right? I haven't been paying attention. But I think that this, this story in particular is probably, I mean, they're all pretty good. And Peterson talks about the Bible as being a library and not a story, right? It's every little thing that makes its way into this story is there for a reason, because it's been passed down for so long. And this one in particular is sort of the saddest story ever told, right? It's everything tragic you could put into a story. And it's full of archetypes, right? And we are not just Jesus, we're Mary, we're Judas, we're Pontius Pilate. Like every piece of this has, a potential to identify with. And I've been thinking a lot about the story this week. This is all really well timed, and it's just, God, it's so sad. I mean, Jesus comes into this city. He's greeted with singing and palms and joy. You're up, right? You're on an upswing, and then just a few days later, he's betrayed by his best friend, his brother, in the garden, and that betrayer, that Judas, is us. He's then also denied by another one of his brothers 3 times. He's someone who just lies in his face and walks away from him, that betrayal. And then there's the actual crucifixion, which is just sort of the worst thing, the worst way you could possibly kill someone, right? It's slow, you die of dehydration, it's just awful. And it's coming. And then you have Pontius Pilate, this character who knows that Jesus is innocent and is susceptible to the mob, and that's all of us when we don't speak our truth. You have this other criminal, Barabbas, who's actually a criminal, and he's released. Sorry, I have some little children around me. He's actually released, and Jesus, is there like, hey, you're releasing this dude, and the crowd is yelling for him, the same crowd that just welcomed him in. And then he walks to his death, and his mother, I mean, that's the classic female archetype, has to let him go and has to watch him die. You have this other traveler who has to help him carry his cross along the way, not knowing who he is, but has to carry that burden. And then, as all of you have said, he has to walk forthrightly into it. And he denies it. I mean, he asks why God has forsaken me, but then eventually he says, forgive them, they know not what they do. And he has to look at the face of malevolence, as Peterson would say, and forgive it and accept it. And then he's put in the tomb, right? He's put in the darkness, And a few days later, he's reborn and born into the light, and there's that juxtaposition. So I think, you know, there's so much more to this story than just that one figure. There's all these individual failures and potentialities, and that I think, I don't know what that means. I don't know what that metaphysical and narrative, you know, that's a lot of words. But I think there's certainly a lot to identify with in the narrative. That's kind of all I got. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. Wonderful to have you back. And this is a perfect time. You know, this is just the beginning, because on Saturday, we want to really go through the story and see the full meaning of it. I mean, it's all those characters, and I really like your observation that all of them is you. It's different aspects of you, different potentialities with you. And you have to say, yes, this is all part of being. Kind of denying it doesn't help. It's actually going to hurt you. Just accepting of all of that. Secondly, I mean, just the sheer concentration of this, the death followed by resurrection. I mean, it's so brilliant. I mean, just from the aesthetic perspective, from the beauty of it, from the power of it, from the conceptual meaning of it, the emotional impact of it, it's all concentrated, and it's basically God on earth, stopping, you know, moving. It's exactly the Spirit, the Word becoming flesh, the Word in flesh form, transitioning out from that. So it's like it's like the essence of the whole of the whole of Bible. So and the point that Jordan Peterson makes, and I think it's profoundly true, is we can talk about it in metaphors, and we can talk about it around it and try to grapple with it. And there is always much more than what we get, because it is a profound thing. It is like the Tao. You know, it is like we're trying to get, the whole purpose of it is to get to God the Father, and we can't see the God directly. It's the same like Brahma, which is there in everything, and it is the principle. At the same time, it has no name, and but you try your best, and you keep trying it. And I think it is wonderful, this kind of format where each person talks about it in their own way, and hopefully each of us pick something up from each other and go from there. So thank you so much, Claire. Next up is Jacob. Jacob, welcome back to you as well.
Thank you. First of all, can you all hear me okay? I'm
Very
sitting
well.
out on the porch and there's traffic, so hopefully you can still hear me pretty clearly. Yeah. I have so much to say on this, but I find myself not having much to say at the moment. First of all, I have a very different perspective than most on this, because, well, I don't want to begin sentences with I think or I believe. So I'm going to be true to my convictions and speak of these things as a matter of fact. And I hope that's understood not as an imposition of my beliefs on everybody else, but just I want to be true to my convictions. So I won't begin with I think and, well, I believe. But rather, I'm going to speak of this as it is. So Jesus isn't God. Jesus is God's son, as the text plainly says. So when we're talking about sacrifice, I think Joe alluded to this and Jordan alluded to it briefly in his video, that the ultimate sacrifice is not of oneself, but of one most dearly loved, such as a son. And it's evident to me that truth grounds out in the body. And to give an example of what I mean, I don't know if any of you watched Jordan Peterson's interview, I think it was a year or two ago, with Mohammed Salvi. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but he's the man who spent about 15 years in Guantanamo. And there's a very, very poignant moment where Jordan asks him, what's worse, being tortured or listening to someone else being tortured? And Jordan didn't even finish. It was if he didn't even finish asking the question and Muhammad already had the answer. And it was an easy answer. And he said, oh, that's easy. Watching or hearing someone else suffer was by far worse. So that truth grounded out that it's the ultimate sacrifice, the ultimate torture is to hear someone you love being tortured. So I think well, there I go with I think. Dang it. We're off base if we don't understand that the Father and Son are different. They're separate. Father is eternal and the Son's a created being. Because then if you understand that, then you properly put the focus on the Father as the one performing the ultimate sacrifice. Watching his beloved Son suffer and die. Now that's not to minimize Christ's sacrifices. Greatest man who ever lived. It was an extraordinary sacrifice. Incomprehensible nearly. But to apprehend what the sacrifice is and what it means, the focus should be on the Father, because he made the ultimate sacrifice. And that opens up all sorts of questions. What were the two marshmallows for the Father? Right, the marshmallow test, right? Don't eat one and you get two. Well, what was the Father making a sacrifice for? I'll probably just stop right there, because that has to be ironed out, right? The identity of Christ in relation to his Father before we can even begin to understand this.
Yes. God so loved the world. That's the answer, I think. But look forward to discussing this in detail on Saturday. But great points. And that's what, I think Jordan Peterson, it so happens I'm reading, I'm going through Genesis and just read Isaac and Abraham. And it's exactly the same. It's like Jordan Peterson puts it beautifully. He says, if you want to talk about the ultimate sacrifice, it is either your own life or that of your child, the loved one. And here it is both at the same time. You're absolutely right. It is it's the Father who is watching this, and that's going to be much, much harder than the Son. So thank you. I have many things to say about what you've said, but it's very profound, and we'll continue discussing it. Thank you, Jacob. Next up is going to be Jyoti, Avanik, and Joe. Jyoti.
Got it. Okay. I'm very impressed with Jordan Peterson. So I had followed all his series when you were doing. And I'm not going to talk about his biblical implications, about his rules of life and principles in life, but I just have one statement to make, When he fell sick, he had a neurological problem when he was in Europe.
But you're
Right.
going to be talking about this video, right?
I know. This pertains to what his
Sure.
his principles
Go ahead.
that he's talking about. Give something of your own.
Sure.
Give it up or given to become somebody that you can become. What if his family, who had taken care of him at that time, they thought that they should leave him because he's not serving them anymore? Now they have to go and find themselves and become somebody that they think they can become and waste their time on him taking care of him. What suggestion would he have, who he would have had for them under those circumstances?
Okay.
Am I making sense?
No. I mean, the topic is, what did you get from this particular video?
Well, I got this, that
Oh.
his sacrifice, his idea about sacrifice is give up something of your own, reborn, become somebody that you can be in this life. So if that's his principle, then why people don't apply that in such situations,
No, that's
in a relationship, in a day-to-day situations and what have you? Okay.
Okay. That is, let me think. So that's not what he's saying. He's saying actually exact opposite of that. What he's saying is that he's not saying that give up your values. He's actually saying that whatever you think is good, do whatever it takes to build that. He's not saying, it's not about saying, okay, just give up things that, that are troublesome for you. He's actually saying, take the trouble. He's exactly saying opposite of that do take care of things that are, people who are important to you. So it is exactly opposite. So that's what I would say. But I don't want to go too far off topic. Next up is going to be Evanik, followed by Joe and Maritza. Evanik.
Yeah, something that Claire was saying about Judas. And first I want to talk about how she said, like, we see ourselves in all of them. And I want to talk about that because in Judas, like, we particularly see ourselves in Judas is famously vilified, right? In the Bible. And he is vilified because, of course, he's the one that turns Jesus over. He's the bad guy. But that was his part in the story. He was in throughout scriptures, he was always supposed to do that. Like, it was almost like that was his purpose according to the Bible. And I think the reason why we vilify him so much is that we see the part of ourselves that we don't like in him. And I think it's going to the Jordan Peterson video. It's kind of like that statement that he said, if you don't like something that you see, evaluate your own self and your own values. That's what Judas requires us to do, in a sense, the character of Judas, right? If you're looking at this as a story, because we're all vilifying Judas, yet we see in the Bible that this is Judas's role. And it's almost like it can't be helped. So it's one of those things where I think if you look at Judas, you're looking at Judas in the periphery, right? But you also see Judas, like, we can also see ourselves in Judas, and that's the part that we don't like. It's just painful to even look at. I think when we're talking about Namaste being the God in you, the God in me sees the God in you. I think about that when I was thinking about that when Claire was talking about Judas, because I'm like, did anybody ever see the God in Judas? They thought and Jesus at one point says the devil, or the scripture says, I can't remember if Jesus says this or not exactly, but the scriptures say the devil entered Judas. So at some point there is God. And they said the sin of Judas it was the betrayal, but he could have repented, right? Like, we were taught in church that he could have repented. Like, if he had looked at his values, like Jordan Peterson said, I don't like, if Judas didn't like what he saw in himself when he did it, he could have looked at himself and repented. But I think that Judas, instead of vilifying him, if we don't vilify him, if we just see him for who he is, and we understand that that part can be in us, we can change what we value so that we wouldn't do what Judas did instead of just the vilification. So I liked what Claire said about that. Like, that is part of us. And like, we like to deny that. And, you know, even Peter, when Jesus was like, one of you are going to betray me, and Peter's like, no, I'll never do that. And then he looks at Peter and he says, oh, tonight you're going to do it 3 times. And I think that's what Jesus was saying, is like, you're going to look down on Judas for doing it, but you're about to do the same thing. You're going to really do the same thing. And I think Jesus was trying to tell us, if you don't like something in somebody else, or, you know, I was always taught, if you don't like somebody, it's usually because there's something you don't like in you, and to change who you are. It doesn't mean that you have to hang around the person, but that's something for later. And then one more thing, when we talk about God making the ultimate sacrifice, and I thought about that when Shane Marie was talking about, is it really a sacrifice if you know that the good is going to come out of it? And I don't know, I'm just throwing this out there. I don't know if it's true or not, but it just made me think. God knew the ultimate good was going to come out of it. And I know it was painful to see his son suffer. I don't deny that one bit. But was it, under Shane Marie's question, was it a sacrifice if he knew it was going to turn out well? If he knew that Jesus did this, that he was going to be able to save all of us, was it really the ultimate sacrifice? Like, God knew eventually Jesus was going to come back to him. But in Isaac, in Abraham and Isaac, Abraham was willing to make the sacrifice and do the killing himself, thinking, oh, well, God's going to work it out. So I'm wondering if in Abraham's eyes, was that a sacrifice? I'm just wondering, because that just made me think about it when Shane Marie said it. And I was like, that's a good point. Like, if you don't know if it's going to, like, the sacrifice is you don't know how it's going to turn out. Or maybe the sacrifice is that you know how it's going to turn out. I don't know. It's just something to think about.
Thank you, Evanik. I think it's different for us than God, of what is likely to happen. Our ability to kind of figure things out is much lower. And even if you know what is going to happen, the fact that your son is suffering is not something that is, that is easy to see. Even if you say, okay, he's being tortured right now, but he's going to be okay. Still, seeing him being tortured is going to, it's going to be hard for you. Next up is going to be Joe, Maritza, Shane Marie, Beckilo, and Jacob. Joe.
Just briefly, I'm just going to comment and build on something that Jacob had mentioned about this idea of sacrificing what you love most in this world, and because it did trigger something for me that I thought of, where somebody I know that really lost her husband suddenly, and she sacrificed her life for him. He was very, 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 very successful as a human being, as a father, and certainly professionally. And when he died, I was speaking to his wife, and I mentioned, well, maybe he needed you to sacrifice one more time, because I don't know if he'd been able to do it without you. Maybe this is the sacrifice that he really needed. In other words, and it was a comforting function that losing someone you love the most, that you really truly love, and that somebody that loves you, well, in a way, it's not something you're willingly entering into, but it is a sacrifice nonetheless of a sort. It's not a true sacrifice because you're not willingly entering into it, but in a way, you're still sacrificing because you're taking on the burden of that person not having to feel the loss that you're feeling. And I just thought about that in the sense of when you're thinking about this in terms of sacrificing the one that you love most, or in order to become even the things you love most, to become your ideal self. And that's a heroic act in a way. It's not an act that you're going into willingly, and that's a big part of this, but it's it's an example of a sacrifice that had come to mind when Jacob was speaking.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Maritza, followed by Shane Marie. Maritza.
I want to make 2 points. First, I'd like to bring the attention to the word meaning and how it is inseparable from the concept of sacrifice, specifically as it's presented to us by Jordan Peterson. We are shown and kind of fed the concept that the whole point of sacrifice is in search of meaning, ever looking to aim closer to this search for meaning, to give meaning to what we're doing, why we're here. That's so if one considers sacrifice, if one is sacrificing that which one most loves, it cannot be done devoid of meaning. And as such, a callous throwing away of something does not fall under the same banner as the sacrifice, due to the very nature of it having a distinct lack of meaning. Like, how can it be so overwhelmingly hard for you to fall under the banner of sacrifice if it's not also meaningful to you? The two are irreparably intertwined, and it's a nice sounding board for judging whether one is holding a rock or a ruby, because we can check to see which is bringing meaning into my life, into my circle, into my community. It's and also I would like to remind folks that there's a slight bias here. Jordan Peterson believes that all of life is sacrifice. That is, for him, that's an axiomatic statement. So when one is considering his tenets on sacrifice, bear that in mind. And also a shallow perspective of sacrifice just cannot work in what we're viewing here in several of his writings and in his videos, just specifically due to that nature, that, maps of meanings. That's his magnum opus. He tells us that everything we do, you return to this ache, this search. This is the goal. The goal is to find meaning. And sacrifice is another path towards this end goal, is what he's saying to us. And, the idea of, in the quote I read out for you, accepting the terrible responsibility of life. That is almost the concept of when one purposefully moves with intention, instead of allowing ourselves to float, and it becomes second nature to do so, there is a freedom to be found. And that takes us to this imagery of the myth of the phoenix. In accepting such a heavy mantle, we actually lighten our burden. And I view, Christ the Son, to my perspective, his ultimate sacrifice is that he knew his entire life, he knew what his end would be. For most of us, our end is a great unknown, as scary to us as the concept of being nailed to a cross and abandoned by everyone. And I really appreciate the perspective given that that statement, Mike, and that was Jean Marie saying that, my God, why have you forsaken me, is actually his realization that he would not have his father in that moment. Whereas the rest of his life, as he was walking towards his certain horrible end, he felt comforted knowing he had his father there. He may not have realized that this ultimate sacrifice included the abandonment of his own son. For Jesus, the Son, his sacrifice, he was sacrificing the love of being this sacrificial emblem of the world. And if we remember that you also cannot separate Jesus from God, there is an intertwining there. Also, he's the massive love for the world that God has. It lives within the Son as well. And as such, this sacrifice is for this world, because he believes that in doing this, he is bringing about the salvation of masses. He's embracing, this is a necessary sacrifice that I must make. And that's where I find that I can see the corollary for the greatest, that which is most loved is one sacrifice. That's where I see it there presented in the Son. Thank you.
Thank you, Marisa. So, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. The point that you're making of meaning is fundamental, because it's really not about sacrifice itself. Sacrifice is simply a means to an end. And what is the end? End is to be at that center. In the diagram that I always use, it's your march towards the center. Sacrifice is saying, it's to put it in the visual terms, there is the light at the center, which is God the Father. The sun is like a diamond, which is shining that light in multiple colors, showing you different things. He's showing you understanding with the word. He's showing you love. He's showing you how to walk towards the Father. Those are the three things he's showing. So it's like a diamond that is taking the pure white light, splitting it into these three colors. And so you can, it is like a map for you. Walk this way. That's what he's doing. From your understanding, it's engaging your mind, it is engaging your heart, and it is engaging your body. And he's showing you a unified perspective in his person. And it is God on earth. It is 100% God, 100% man. It is man. So it is there on earth. And it is God at the same time. And moving towards that is what we're talking about. So sacrifice in that sense to look at it purely from a light perspective is to turn towards the light. Otherwise, you're turned kind of at the periphery. You're looking at things around you, which are kind of gray. Or you're looking away from the God with all kinds of delusions, all kinds of hatred. But most of the times, most people are looking sideways into the gray. But if you want to look at geometry, if you keep on going along the circle, it is, it's a tangent. It goes into the darkness because you will keep going away from it. So in a very simple way, it's all about showing you which way the light is. And his whole life, his whole being is about that. And sacrifice is simply turning towards the light. That's how I understand it. And you can't really understand sacrifice without the concept of the light in the middle, because that's the meaning. That's the ultimate goal. That's what you're going towards. The turning away from it is a means towards turning away from other things other than the light is a way of going towards the light. Shane Murray.
Okay, so I'm still grappling myself with this idea of God's sacrifice. And I'm thinking possibly that, say he knew that Jesus would live again, but maybe the sacrifice was that he didn't know how his own sacrifice would resurface in the lives of his other children. So maybe that too is a mystery to him, how his message will ultimately end up resurrecting or not resurrecting within his other children. So maybe he maintains a bit of that mystery or unknowing himself. I know we suggest God is all knowing, but I guess he could see outward and know which person this has impact on or doesn't have impact on. But I would imagine in the choice of choosing to sacrifice his son, that he's kind of throwing the dice at it and saying, I'm willing to make this sacrifice in the hopes that the resurrection and truth of Christ gets revealed through you in your own life. And then the other thing that I was thinking is if he even if he knew the outcome, if he knew that certain people wouldn't respond to the message, that's a very painful recognition that has to go along with that level of sacrifice. That one, your child suffers in that way for people to fail to receive it, and two, your other children fail to receive the message of your deep and profound love. So there's a depth there, I think, that pertains much to that sacrifice, but in a different way.
Wonderful. Oh, beautiful, beautiful points. Thank you. So what I would say is that, this is a fundamental point. What God does is that he gives you grace. So it's like the light that is shining on the periphery. But you have to ask, you have to choose, and you have the capability of turning your back on it. So it is in hands of each person at each moment to either turn towards the light or away from it or sideways. That is there. And all God can do is he can love the world. And that's what he does. He loves the world. He says, okay, I'm going to send the Son to show the world a path to me. Jesus is nothing but a path because he is half God, half man. And because he's half man, not half man, but full man and full God, because he's man, he suffers everything a man can suffer. And it provides an example of what can be. Now, it is up to us. You can choose to either say yes to God or no to God, or ignore. All those three things are in each person's hands. So there is the grace that is raining down. So the light is coming down. Okay, but you don't have to turn towards it. You can look sideways, you can turn your back on it. And that's the nature of Christian doctrine, as best as I understand it. Next up is Becky, followed by Jacob. Becky.
I wanted to come back to what Claire and Ebony had spoken about with the division of good and evil. And it's true that a lot of us fall to that reductionism of us versus them and to put ourselves into the better light. And Peterson says, when you see that good and evil are both within you, then that's when all that falls away of that division. And there's understanding, there's compassion, and there's also that responsibility put onto yourself, because when you say, oh, well, they're bad and I'm good, there's no more responsibility. It just is. But when you see that there's bad in me, I'm responsible for keeping myself in check. And that's where that dying to self is necessary, because, well, why is it bad? It's because of carnal desires. It's me putting myself above everyone else. It's not good for the community, and it also leads to walking towards the darkness, because that selfishness, when you give into it over and over, and it's what you said, Shrikant, about like sacrifices turning towards a light, giving yourself over selfishness is walking away. And the more that you walk away, the more you quiet and you dampen your conscience, so that you're less sensitive to what is good, and you become. So your actions, it's a feedback loop. You act and you become and you believe, and the more that you that you act in wickedness, the harder it is for you to come back. And not that it's not possible, but it is very difficult. And so the importance of sacrifice is that you do it over and over in order to keep yourself from succumbing to that darkness that's inside of you.
Thank you, Becky. This is a very deep point. I always in the Gospels, I really love the way in which Jesus deals with Peter and Judas and everybody else, because he's simply asking people, and he accepts. Now, for example, consider the fact he knows Judas is going to do this, yet he doesn't do anything. He doesn't try to stop it. He doesn't, he knows what Peter is going to do. He doesn't stop Peter. He asks them. And then my favorite thing is, whenever anybody is interacting with him, the first thing he will say, what do you seek? So that loop of, God giving you something, but then you have to do something, and you have to understand it in your own way and come to it. And only when you do that, you have something. And when he's doing something good, he, what shall I say? He has this kind of serene acceptance that, okay, now it is in their hands and they will do what they will do. And so something like that, I'm not articulating it well, but there is an acceptance, a serene acceptance of the nature of the world, the nature of that there is evil in this world. There is people who are not going to care, people who are going to try to destroy the light. And that is the world, and you still love the world. That aspect is there. And that is true also for God the Father. He knows what the world is. And so it's that loop of kind of the grace falling on you and the Holy Spirit motivating you to go towards the light. Thank you, Becky. Next up is Jacob.
So on the matter, I think it was I forget her name. Anyhow, Shane Marie. I think she brought up this topic. What was it? How is it a sacrifice, right? If they both knew the outcome. How is that a real sacrifice? I wrestled with this for such a long time.
Jacob, there is a sound that is coming. That's a scratching sound that is coming from your. Maybe your speaker is moving against something.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's
How's
much
that?
better. Much better.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for catching that. I wrestled with this for a very long time. You know, the sacrifice of Christ is presented in the Holy Writings as, well, pretty important. The ultimate act of love on the part of Christ and on the part of Jehovah. And I was unimpressed. I was unimpressed for a really long time for the reasons stated here. It's like, well, he's God, he knows the outcome. How is this impressive? Well, I firmly believe in revelation, meaning Deuteronomy says this. It says, things concealed belong to Jehovah and the things revealed belong to us. So after wrestling with this, like a good Jacob, it was revealed to me, at least in part. So the scriptures say this, that 1,000 years is as one day to the Father, right? That part of the verse gets quoted often, but the second part of the verse almost never gets talked about. You know what it says? And a day is as 1,000 years. So I'm going to try to be concise with this. It's a hard idea to get across, which just tells you that I don't understand it well enough, but I'm going to try anyway. You might have had this experience if you've ever been in a car accident or some other really frightening, potentially death-dealing event. There's this sense that time slows down, and that's a shared experience. I mean, some of you might immediately know what I'm talking about, and this is my little interpretation of that. You know, when your body goes into survival mode, well, sense data becomes far more important. You know, if it's a car accident, well, there's flying glass and there's all sorts of chaos. And because now you have to take in sense data at a higher rate of resolution, it actually has the effect of slowing time down. So here you have the Father now, an eternal being, no beginning, no end. And sure, 1,000 years is like a day to him. It zooms by. Some of us who are getting older, we know what that's like. The older we get, time seems to speed up, right? We'll just extrapolate now. If you're an eternal being, 1,000 years will just fly by. But the reverse is also true. During a time of crisis, time slows down. So now here you have God the Father, and let's say in the midst of his ultimate pain and suffering, time, that's a whole can of worms to talk about time from God's perspective. But the Holy Writings are a communication to man so that we can get at least the gist of God's experience. So when he tells us that time can slow down for him, that a day can feel like 1,000 years, well, let's just keep it simple and imagine what that's like. A day feeling like it lasts 1,000 years. So Christ was dead for 3 days. So if we apply that formula, well, to the Father, it was as if Christ was gone for 3,000 years. And then you can talk about, well, let's just walk through Christ's impalement and his torture. Well, that probably felt like maybe 50 years or something. So when that hit me, I was impressed. Imagine watching your child suffer for like 50 years. and then him being gone for 3,000. So that began to help me see that, my head wasn't screwed on right when I was reading the scriptures in such a surface way that I just missed the whole thing. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacob. Always love your comments. Thank you. All right, folks. So now I want to open it up for any questions anybody wants to put on the table. You can go ahead and type exclamation mark if you'd like to ask any questions. We'll collect all the questions, and then everybody gets a chance to answer all of them. Again, what I want to do is on Saturday at 4:30, we'd be looking at the death and resurrection of Christ, this time not through Jordan Peterson, but through Gospel of John, Gospel of Matthews, or Luke, any of the Gospels. You can use any of the text to look at actually what was said and what it means. We have a statement about forsaken. I really love the scene in the garden. I also love, the entire sequence, the entire, basically we'll be covering everything from the Palm Sunday all the way. So the scene of Jesus washing the feet of his disciples, it just goes on and on. I mean, it just, that entire part of, I'm familiar mostly with the Gospel of John, from 12 to 20, I think that's what we're going to talk about. So, but now we're going to take questions. Let's ask all the questions, and then we can choose some of them to answer. I will start with Evanik, followed by Shane Murray. Evanik.
What is the true meaning of sacrifice? Or what is true sacrifice?
Wonderful. What is true sacrifice? Okay. Next up is going to be Shane Murray.
So I was just thinking that this quality of sacrifice that Jordan Peterson described is theoretical at best. It's hard to grasp. It's certainly something that I don't think is inherent.
No answer. Questions.
Yeah,
questions.
yeah. I'm sorry. So I guess my question is, how does this level of light get infused into the consciousness sufficiently that these are ideas that we could actually begin to grasp? So I don't think it's just a simple choice of turning towards God or not. There's some permeability that's not present to all people. I'm not sure what that is. So I would love to hear if anybody had any insight.
Wonderful. So folks, keep the questions coming. Let's collect all the questions, and then we will answer all of them. Madhav.
When Jordan Peterson talks about sacrifice, he brings up the story of Cain and Abel and how some types of sacrifice aren't better or aren't enough. So my question is, what type of sacrifice are optimal, if that even is quantifiable?
Wonderful. What sacrifice is optimal? Excellent. Next up is Claire.
How does God's sacrifice of his son grant us eternal life?
Very good. How does very good. Anybody else? Okay, so let's start. I'm going to start with the final one. Then there is optimal sacrifice, and how is this? Okay, let's take Shane Murray's question first. Shane Murray, could you repeat the question?
So, and I'm sorry, because again, I'm still grappling with it, but so I'm curious, how is consciousness prepared? If God exists, how is consciousness best prepared to receive that truth? Because and in particular, to the extent that we're not just spoken believers, but we act in faith. So it's revealed in our character. We're transformed by the faith sufficiently to reveal it as a operating truth within us. So, so if we could, does that make sense?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay. So folks, that's the question on the table. How is this transmitted? How is this, these ideas about the path to God transmitted, made real? Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to answer that. We'll start with Maritza.
So I was raised in a Christian background very staunchly, and I'm a product of Catholic school upbringing. However, I make the conscious decision in my life these days, and I have for years now, I do not embrace the concept of God as an actual, being that sits above us all. So when I view all of these works, for me, I view them as philosophical edicts. To me, this concept of God is some type of a philosophy or a spark or a guidance for us. So I suggest to you or to anyone grappling with this that maybe try to view it from that perspective. I have not yet found any text which speaks to this God concept where I cannot extrapolate massive amounts of meaning and guidance for how I should move forward in my seeking of meaning in life. So I, project that for you.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe. Folks, if you'd like to answer the question, go ahead and type exclamation mark. Joe.
I mean, the question is, how is it transmitted? I mean, essentially.
Yeah. We're saying we're talking about God. We're talking about a path to God. How does this actually get transmitted to an individual person where it serves as an actual guide for moving towards it?
I mean, it gets transmitted in this particular case through the Gospels, and it's a guide gives you a guide through your actions ultimately. I mean, it's who you are, it's your character that you're kind of, if you're accepting this as your, philosophy of life, this is essentially what, you're taking this as gospel and following it with your actions. Now, that's not to say that there aren't other philosophies of life that are similar in nature, and that where you can turn towards the center or towards God, and your actions wouldn't be similar. But that's the way I view it, is something that it's an acceptance of God's grace, and then you're living that in your everyday actions.
Thank you. Next up is Claire.
This is a hard one. I was also gonna say through action. And Peterson has this thing about object and action, and that, life is something that we go through action. And I don't really know what that means, but that's what he says. I mean, at least for me, I've only been able to identify with a higher power through action rather than belief. Like for me, it's really hard to just believe and have that blind faith, but it's more like I pray, it works, I feel something different, and then I believe. And I think that sort of action, there's like an action oriented element to it. Also just some 12 rules come to mind, shrink your timeline. Jake was talking about time. If you can cut down your timeline to a moment, I think it's easier to observe, or maybe lengthen your timeline. And then also paying attention, right? Like it's easier to perceive when I'm paying attention. I'll stop there, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Claire. Next up is Becky.
I really liked what Claire just said, because it's what we say we think, right? That requires our frontal cortex to be like, oh, I think there's like two levels, right? Because it's like I think, whereas with action, it reveals a feeling, and your feelings are straight to what you value. And so what you think you believe is not as, or what you think you value is not as direct as what is revealed to you through the emotions of action. And so, I thought that was very insightful. In terms of like consciousness, and how that's revealed to you, of like, how do you take in that belief? It's what you said, Shrikant, of what you had quoted earlier. And I tell you, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and one who seeks finds. And to the one who knocks, it will be opened. And it requires being honest, and really finding truth. There's, if you can put your pride aside and really seek after things, test everything that you know, strong beliefs held loosely, really not let things die when they need to. Your presuppositions, if they do not hold against what you see, then you need to, in order to bring in that new information and evolve. And so it's humility. It's finding truth with humility. And when you're willing to do that, he'll reveal himself. He'll give you the truth. And it also goes back to being selfless. And when you walk towards truth and light, you become more sensitive, as I had mentioned before. But when you walk away, you become less sensitive. And so there's this part when we're reading, let's see. Yeah, it was about like John, we read like he revealed himself in the flesh, but they did not perceive who he was. And then there's this other parable later on, like in a different chapter, well, in a different gospel, but it says, to you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For to the one who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. You will indeed hear, but never understand, and you will indeed see, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them. And that's that action loop that we had mentioned. When you turn away from trying to find truth, you're purposely closing yourself off.
Thank you, Becky. So my way of approaching this comes from Gita. You use three things. You use your mind, you use your heart, and you use your body. So you try to understand what this work is. Actually, it is so deep. It's like you have to let it flow over you, and you keep on getting more meaning out of it. It is really, truly magnificent. These works, all of them, whether it is Bhagavad Gita, Tao Te Ching, or Gospel of John, they are incredibly deep. So you have to understand, you have to try to understand. So that's number one. That's like 3 leg 2. Stu. The second one is that you have to have devotion, because ultimately the center is simply, God is simply truth. What is it? What is it? What's the meaning of existence? What is it? Truth. It is goodness. It is beauty, all of it in one thing. So you're trying to understand the truth. So you're, fearlessly trying to understand the truth. You're throwing away things of your misconceptions. You have plenty of them, and you will continue to have plenty of them, but you're continuously doing that. Similarly, for whatever truth you understand as truth, you have full devotion to it. You have full love of it. And your heart has to be fully engaged. You can't, it's not just an intellectual exercise. Your heart has to be, and the combination of that is actually expression. So you express it in your own way. That's the way in which you engage your mind and your heart together through your expression. When you speak, for example. The third thing you do is that you walk. So like, if you look at the entire sequence, like the woman's from Samaria, you hear, you understand that it is true, then you love it, and then you walk. You take action. And that action is also critical. And all of these, just like Gita explains, they build on each other. The more you understand, the more you love. The more you understand, the more your action is virtuous. The more virtuous action you're taking, the more you will understand. The more you will love. More you love, more you will understand. So it's like they all build on one another, and it triangulates. And you have to have infinite patience, because you still know that by your nature, you're a creature of habit. You will get attached to the ideas that you have. You will get attached to the emotions that you have. And when you do, you will be going sideways in the beginning and then away from the center. That's going to happen. So you have to have patience for it, and you keep doing that. And there is a win-win between other people. You see other people doing that. You will find that they are going to be better than you on some things. You learn from them. That's the shortcut. So that's the part of the community. That's part of the action, that you do it in a community so you can grow faster. Everybody is trying to go towards the center. You go there faster because some people are ahead on some aspect than the other. Okay, let's.
Oh, Shrikant, I just want to make a quick comment.
Yeah,
that's why we're all here.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Next up is Maritza, followed by Mike. Maritza.
Oh man, I have to go after that. I just a little tiny nugget here, because in the question, Shane Marie also brought up the question of consciousness. I synonymize the aspects of the guarding of one's soul that we see in so many of the scriptures and the texts of God and the Bible. I synonymize that with one's consciousness, one's soul. And so, where we're shown the importance of feeding one's soul, and the mixture she can't just give us is actually beautiful. I can't top that. But where we're shown that we should take care with our soul, I view it as also, this is saying, take care with one's consciousness. Everyone here or several have mentioned action. So accepting responsibility is a form of action. So if we take on the mantle of, being aware of our consciousness and what we're doing with that, instead of just floating along, it's, Peterson tells us that it's in responsibility that most people find the meaning that sustains them through life. I see that same phrase reflected in so many of the different guiding parables and statements that we find threaded throughout so much of Bible. So I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maritza. Next up is Mike.
I was thinking maybe we receive the transmission or find the path through some strange form of attrition. Meaning, we live our lives sometimes haphazardly for many years, and we're looking for truth and we're looking for integrity, all the words that we've used. And when we find a path that we think is the right one, but it's really not, if it doesn't contain enough integrity or truth, and it's hollow, and eventually it's going to break and fall away. And it's almost, as you get later in your life, it's almost where you look up and say, well, what's left standing here? I've been looking for a very, very long time, looking for truth and integrity. And then I look up, and just as Becky said, that's why we're all here. So this very moment in my life, I'm looking out at these faces and getting to know some of you. So maybe it's a form of almost trial and error, and eventually you find yourself on a path where you feel connected to that transmission that you talked about, and what you look around and see is not hollow at all. It's filled up with as much integrity as you can find, and maybe that's your path.
No, absolutely. And I want to build on what Becky said. I mean, it's absolutely, this community it's a great example of how you do it. So because you're trying to understand things, everybody's trying to understand things. Okay, everybody who is here because they love it. They love this process, this entire kind of community, people here, what we do. So love is there, and we actually come here every day, again and again and again and again, to do that. So those are the three axes. You have the blue axis, which is the thinking part. You have the red axis, which is the love part. And then you have the green axis, which is the action part. All three have to come together. Now, let me give you one more level that I've come up with just yesterday. There are these combinations of the two. So when you combine this combination, by the way, is combination of light. Okay, the red, blue, and green are the primary colors of light. So when you split white, so basically these are the primary colors of light. Okay, when you combine the blue, so the blue, that's the thinking, and the emotion, you get magenta. Okay, that's the color of, I think of it as artistic expression. So it's like your expression of your thought, full of emotion. Okay, that's what art at its best is. Okay, when you look at the combination of the red and the green, it is basically your love of something concrete. That's where your home life, your friends and family is. So it's like you are working on, like, friends and family, you're working on your artistic expression. And the third one, the combination of blue, the thinking, and the acting, is the community as a whole, or economy as a whole, the world as a whole that you're living in. So you are conscious. So these three aspects of you combine into these three areas: your expression, your loved ones, and your place in the community. So you have to do things right by everything. So for example, even if a stranger shows up here, the way we deal with them is actually something which is very respectful. We are open to strangers. That is the part of combination of thinking. It's kind of keeping like an open society, making sure that everybody can make whatever mistakes that they want to make, and it is okay. All of that is that. Expression is each of us expressing ourselves as best as we possibly can. And the thing is that the friendships that are developing as a result of that. So these are all kind of three different combinations of those three things. So that's also, and Jesus also epitomizes that. Look at the expression that he has. Okay, it is just amazing. Beautiful way of expressing. The parables are like high art, full of thought. Okay, his love for his disciples, you can see that, and you can see his actions regarding the whole world. So what he's showing you is not only just how to know how to love and how to act, but also how do you express yourself? How do you deal with your loved ones? And how do you deal with the community as a whole? So he's like taking that white light and dividing it into, so this one is magenta, this one is yellow, and this one is cyan. You can look up, if you can do Google search on primary colors of light, you can see them all. But that's what it is. These are like the combinations in areas of your life that are produced by the root capabilities. All right. Next up is Evanik.
Yeah, I was actually going to build on Becky's point too about 52 living ideas and being here in this community. I think when you're looking for a spiritual path or meaning or something, I think this is like a model of how to do it. To hear about many different ideas, many different religious beliefs, and taking from it what you, and kind of taking from it what you need. And in a sense, it's like, if that thing, so like, I also use the example of the Bible because that's the one I studied, Catholic schoolgirl here. I was Christian for a long time, still consider myself a Christian. I just don't go to church. But as a Christian, there are certain things in the Bible that I just don't believe. And before, that gave me great guilt because I was taught that you have to believe everything in the Bible. Then I started to study how the Bible was made. And then I was like, I don't know. And then it was frowned upon to doubt any part of the Bible. I think when I came to 52 Living Ideas, I came to it because of the Tao Te Ching, right? And I wanted to study it. And then it was like, oh, well, there's a lot of interpretations and there's a lot of Christian interpretations. And it was a way to show, it was a different way of getting to the same point. And then we went into the Gita. And then I was like, oh, well, this makes sense. This feels right. And I think what you were saying about that triangle, thinking, the emotion, the thinking, the heart, and the action, I think is just key. And it's throughout all types of religious texts. It's kind of like, especially with your thoughts, and I think the Gita does a great job of this. I think the Bible does too, but I think the Gita is clearer on this point. Is, you have thousands and thousands and thousands of thoughts, right? You don't have to believe any of these. Like, you don't have to think your thoughts. You could just let that thought pass by you and just recognize that it's just one of the thousand ones. And I think once you study, you can pick out your path. And I think that's the beauty of the Gita, is that there's many different paths. And if you find that to be true, the path you pick is the path that is meant for your soul. And I think when Maritza was talking about, a philosophy of life, that's also another way of finding out, who, not only like what to follow, but who you are. You can look at these as philosophies of life and pick the philosophy that works best for you as a person. But like, when you pick it, it has to be something that you truly believe in your heart, because like I said, it goes back to your values. What is it that you value? And if that path that you're picking goes along with your values, that's great. If it's not, though, then you either have to evaluate your values or evaluate the path. And maybe sometimes what I've been finding in these past, well, I guess year now, I guess it's been over a year since I've been in 52 Living Ideas. What I found is that when I look at a path, I'm like, is it the path that's wrong for me? Or is it that my values are changing? And that works because it's just like letting go of right and wrong paths and just saying, okay, is this the path that I'm meant to walk on? And that's how I think you connect to God. It's like, okay, you're asking, like you said, you're seeking the truth. What is the path I'm meant to walk on? Whatever path that is, it's great for you. And it doesn't have to work for the next person, even in this group. That's why we're all here, to learn and to grow. So my path might be different than your path, Sherry Kant, or any other person that I'm looking at here that I've gotten to know over the past year. And that's okay. There doesn't have to be one right path. And I think the beauty that 52 Living Ideas offers is that if my path is not your path, it doesn't mean that your path is wrong. It doesn't mean that my path is wrong. And I can accept that for you. And I can say, maybe I'll look at that, and you can explore and evaluate. And I think that's getting to the core of who you are. And I think that's the spirit in you, or the God, or the light, or whatever you want to call it. That's the God in you. It's like figuring out what path is going to get me to my divinity, to get me to really explore my divinity. I think that's the beauty of what something like this offers, is that you get to figure that out.
Wonderful, beautifully put, Evanique. So last question about nature of sacrifice. What is true sacrifice? When is it an optimal sacrifice? When is it not sufficient? How do you answer these questions? What is a good sacrifice? Joe.
I did like Mother Teresa's saying with this, was give until it hurts, but not until it hurts yourself. Like, so not at the expense of yourself, but something that where you're giving, and that you're actually, it's an actual act of love and sacrifice. But yeah, where if it becomes at the expense of your own personal well-being, which, I struggle with that line. I really do, because I tend to think that you can always rationalize what your well-being is. Like, then you can come by and say, well, I need these 20 minutes to do something better, or something more important. But I think it also has to be I think the most important part of the whole thing is that it's aligned to a value system that you believe in. That's the key, is that it's not just giving indiscriminately, or it's just done with a certain level of intention and understanding with what the outcomes are. So, I mean, I think that's
Sure.
right.
Thank you, Joe. So let me state it again. So we're saying, okay, what is a proper sacrifice? Look at it in the context of Cain and Abel. Why is it that the sacrifice of Abel was good and not of Cain? When is it a good sacrifice, the right sacrifice? Is it the right size? How do you evaluate sacrifice? Next up is going to be Shane Murray, Becky, Maritza, and Evanique. Shane Murray.
So I apologize. I don't think this answers your question, but I was thinking that sacrifice is of benefit when it's transformative. So whatever the sacrifice might be, as long as it's transformative. So say you lose a child, you can make good on that sacrifice by sufficiently transforming yourself in a way that would either be pleasing to your child, to know that as you survive them, that you're living well, or you're being joyful, or so I think the merit would lie in the transformation that comes from it.
Thank you, Shane Murray. Next up is Becky.
I would say that I agree with Shane Murray that the path matters, but so does the results, or the calculated results, because oftentimes we don't know what that is. So like the probability, or it's like the weighted probability, because it's not wise to sacrifice for something less, right? That's it can still feel like it can still be a sacrifice, right? You can give up so much for something valueless. That's not a good sacrifice. And so using that, I want to challenge the quote that Joe had said, not until it hurts yourself. Well, it's well, what comes out of it? If it's better for you to be here, still here, and because you can do so much more, then it's a poor sacrifice to hurt yourself. But John 15:12 says this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friend. And so if I value my friend more than my life, then my friend is valuable. And that is a sacrifice that's worth it.
Thank you. Next up is, let me see. Next up is going to be Maritza, followed by Evanik.
If I recall the parable correctly, the distinction between Cain and Abel was the question of faith. One provided the best that he had within his produce. It was animals, so he was sheep, I think. And the other one only gave some of his crops. Every time I read the parable, I'm left with the impression that for one, it was a hardship. For the other, it was not. It's this question of strife, as it were. If I have, 1,000 coats, what does it cost me to give you one? Or even if I have two, and it's very cold winter, if I have 2 coats and I give you one, I'm still going to be warm. If I have 1 coat and I give that coat to you, because in my mind, I find you have more need, or I'm willing to bear the hardship of being cold for your benefit. That is the distinction that I hear in this parable. And what it makes me think of is the idea of, as we sacrifice, we're peeling back the layers, we're seeking truth, right? Ultimately, again, if we get back to this idea of meaning, we're seeking truth. And even Shrikant said, the center is truth. And so, there's a quote by Peterson. He tells us that the truth is something that burns. It burns off dead wood. And people don't like having the dead wood burnt off often, because they're 95% dead wood. So the idea here is that what makes sacrifice is knowing that this burn is going to hurt, and saying, bring it to the flame.
Wonderful. So I'll say 2 things. Firstly, the Cain and Abel story. I think Abel basically gave his firstborn of the sheep. So basically the best thing that he had, and he gave it with full kind of love and devotion of saying, okay, I actually want to give you the best thing that I have. Whereas I think Cain was going through the motions. He said, this is what I'm supposed to do. I have to go give something. Okay, I'll give you this. Now, the interesting thing was, the problem was not that, because God was not happy with it, and Cain's face fell. So God is saying to him, why are you so down? Because if you actually gave sacrifice from your heart, and if you did the right thing to do, will it not be accepted just like your brothers? So why are you doing that? So that is the heart of it. It's like, God is not saying, oh, you screwed up on this particular execution. That's not the point. The point is that he did that with not his heart in it. Then he goes out and says, okay, I'm not, now somebody has pointed out, God has said, look, you're not doing the right thing, please fix it. All you have to do is to fix it. That's all. So he doesn't do that. He goes and with jealousy, he kills his brother. I mean, so that is very different kind of, so sacrifice is, so it's very interesting. I really like that dialogue of God, why are you down? Sometimes you do something and it doesn't work, so go fix it. And so anyway, next up is Evanik.
Shrikant,
Yeah.
that's also a really great showing of abnegating responsibility. Instead of accepting that somehow there was something in him he needed to change to have a better receiving of his sacrifice, he decided his brother was the problem.
Right, exactly. Next up is Evanik.
Yeah, I think the thing about sacrifice is you have to give the best of you. And so when I was thinking of that Cain and Abel story, the problem with Cain is that he didn't give his best. And he didn't give the best of himself to God. And I think when I think of it, it's like when you have to do something for someone, like if someone asks you to do something and you reluctantly do it and you you do it halfway and it's not sincere. It's almost like I wish he hadn't done it, right? Because it's just pointless. And sometimes it just causes more harm than good. Whereas if you give 100% of your best, even if you make a mistake, you know that that's the best you could do at that time. And then you learn and you grow from it. And I think too, I think when you're giving the best of yourself, it doesn't mean that you give until it does harm to you necessarily. Well, I'll rephrase that. If there is harm that comes to you, is it going to make you a better person? I think Becky said it best. It's like the wisdom in it is it worth the sacrifice? And I think that's the way you have to evaluate. Like, am I going to sacrifice something? Jordan Peterson talks about it. It's like, is what you're going to give up, is that going to get you to something better? And if that answer is yes, then yes, give your 100% best to it. Because at the end of the day, it's going to make you better. Like when Maritza was talking about the burning wood, I was thinking of the scripture where it talks about, I think it's in the Old Testament, where it's about, it might have been in the New Testament, but it's like the refining of gold or silver. And the thing is that you have to put it in the fire, and you have to like get all the chaff away, and you have to get all the impurities out. And the only way you're going to do that is by going in the fire, and it's going to burn and it's going to hurt, but it's going to get you to that purity. And I think that's the key. It's like, because sometimes people sacrifice just for looking good, or because they think it'll make them look good, and they'll give of themselves and sacrifice of themselves, and they'll burn themselves out. And for what? If you ask them why they're doing it, they may not even know. Or, they may say it's because such and such said. So I think it's a point of knowing who you are at your core. That's the first thing. I think Becky's thing is kind of, I don't even know if it's second, but knowing why you're sacrificing what you're sacrificing for. Like knowing what you're sacrificing for and saying, is that worth it? Is it enough? Like, in my mind, is it worth it? And that's knowing the truth of who you are. And then saying, okay, now I'm just going to give it 1,000% because I know it's worth it. And I know it's going to get me to a better place. And I know it's going to help me to learn and to grow. Even that is going to be painful. And even not knowing how the outcome is going to be, I'm going to take the risk and say that the outcome is going to be good. I'm going to evaluate the risk, and I think it's worth it. So I think that's the true meaning.
Wonderful. Beautifully put. Thank you. Next up is Shane Murray.
This is more of a follow-up question, but how do we know what our own dead wood is? Like what do we bring to the altar to sacrifice? Because it seems like and in the Bible, there's suggestions as to what's to be sacrificed, or you find yourself in a scenario in which you're forced to sacrifice. And I think it can be challenging to know where a dead wood lies to bring it there. And I think Evanique had mentioned you have to know yourself, but that's also a very challenging process in and of itself. So if anybody has any insight of how to locate the dead within you, that would be helpful.
Sure. Let's do one thing. Firstly, I want to let everybody know that at 9 o'clock, we have the DAO meetup, and it's the final DAO meetup. So I don't want to hold anybody up. And I don't want to, so I'm going to ask people at the same time. We have the tradition of lightning answers. So if anybody wants to give a lightning answer to the question of deadwood, of how do you identify the dead? By the way, just want to tell you that in India, in Bhagavad Gita context, it's called yajna. Yajna literally means that there is a fire and you throw things in the fire. That's the way you do sacrifice. You things that, and some of it is something that you value, which you say that, look, I'm so devoted that it doesn't, I will do this. In some cases, you're saying, okay, I am giving up parts of me that are not, it's like, it's a way of removing things so that you can become purer. It's a way of actually kind of, burning off the dross. So only the gold remains. So that's what the concept is. So folks, go ahead and just very quick answers. How do you identify the dross? Evanique?
If something is something that you love, but is not good for you. Like it's hard to say like a formula, but it's something like, I always say it's like your intuition, which
Okay.
is different just from thoughts. It's like, trying to think of the word, but it's like a feeling, it's like an intuition. When something's not good for you, you need to sacrifice it. And that's only something that you can know. Sorry, if that's not clear.
Next up is Maritza.
I'm gonna lean on flow concepts here. I say evaluate your psychic entropy and look at where is your attention going, and it's just wasted energy, and maybe that is where the deadwood is.
Okay, so folks, I want to close it out properly. So what we're going to do is that at 4:30 on Saturday, we are going to do the real meetup. This is only the beginning. This is only to kind of get people warmed up about the idea. On Saturday, we're just going to be talking about the death and the resurrection and what it means. So please read up. My favorite is always John, but Matthew's, I've also read, in the last week, this week I've read John and Matthew's on this. I'm yet to read Luke. I'll probably read just Luke in addition to this. And then I'm going to read some of Aquinas' commentaries. Augustine has very interesting things to say about it. Lots of people have interesting things to say about it. Just don't read the whole commentaries. Look at a phrase that really strikes you. I'll say, okay, what is he saying there? And you will be astonished. On the gospel page, I don't know, you search for like Isidore, Isadore, and Aquinas. So let me type it, Isidore and Aquinas. If you search for these two words, you'll find his commentary. And then what I suggest is that read the gospel, any gospel that you want. I know that he has commentary for Matthew as well as John. So you can read, think of a statement, like for example, why have you forsaken me? And see what everybody throughout history up until Aquinas have had to say about that. And you will be astonished how much you will get from that. Or I would also recommend the scene in the garden. So those are the two things I'm going to see for sure. But you can look at, him washing the feet of his disciples. There are just so many gems there. And then when we come, we can go ahead and discuss all of them in the same format. I really like this format where everybody gets to put their 2 cents down and then we discuss it. So we'll continue to do that. All right. Thank you very much, folks. I'll see you soon. Remember, there is the DAO meetup, so you can go to the DAO meetup. I don't have the link handy. Does anybody have the link? Can somebody put the link in if they want, if anybody wants to go there? Let me see if I can find it. Okay, can somebody do that? Just the meetup link. I promised Joe that we would help people get there. I don't want people to be lost. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Evanik. Okay, there it is, folks. Go ahead and you can click on it to transport directly into a completely new Zoom meetup. See you, folks. Bye.